Within minutes, tens of thousands of electricity customers in northern Chile were cut off. Clinics in the hardest-hit city were only partially operating, and officials were already preparing to shut schools the next day. On Monday, May 25, 2026, at 5:52 p.m. local time, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck deep beneath Chile's northern mining belt, near the city of Calama in the Antofagasta region. More than 100 kilometers below the surface, the quake was deep enough to spare Chile from the kind of catastrophic collapse seen in shallower disasters, but powerful enough to spread strong shaking across a huge stretch of the country. At first, there was relief. No tsunami warning, no immediate reports of deaths, but the deeper story was only beginning to come into focus. It was late afternoon across the desert north. In the industrial corridor of Antofagasta, mining operations were still active. In coastal cities like Mejillones and Tocopilla, the day was winding down. Farther inland, communities across El Loa were moving through an ordinary Monday, with local clinics open, public buildings staffed, and schools expecting another normal morning the next day. Northern Chile lives with earthquakes as part of daily reality, but routine has a way of lowering your guard. There is always a moment before a disaster when nothing appears unusual, when the roads are still open, the lights are still on, and the systems people depend on still seem permanent. Then, in a region built on seismic memory, the ground shifted again. At 5:52 p.m., that ordinary afternoon broke apart. The quake struck at intermediate depth, reported between roughly 109 and 114 kilometers, and the shaking spread fast across northern Chile. In Antofagasta, Tocopilla, and Mejillones, reported intensity reached level 6. In Iquique, Alto Hospicio, and San Pedro de Atacama, it reached level 5. Communities much farther south and north also felt it, a sign that this was not just a local tremor, but a regional event. For people on the ground, this is where the first seconds matter most. The hanging lights, the swaying walls, the sudden understanding that this one is stronger than the usual background movement. And because the quake was inland and deep, the uncertainty did not center on the ocean. It centered on what had just failed on land. The first major failure was electrical. Officials initially reported around 22,000 customers without power in Calama, and later reporting placed the outage above 27,000. The mayor warned that roughly 65 to 70% of families in the city could be affected, with priority given to electro-dependent residents whose lives rely on uninterrupted electricity. Municipal emergency teams and utility crews were deployed to inspect the public lighting network and restore service street by street. The healthcare system did not collapse, but it was strained. Local consultorios were reported to be only partially operating, some without energy, while minor damage was also identified in school infrastructure and at the building of the city's second fire company. In Tocopilla, authorities also reported minor rock displacement. By then, the narrative had already widened beyond household fear. This quake was now testing the resilience of public services, emergency response, and the industrial core of northern Chile. What made this earthquake so visually unsettling was not a single scene of collapse, but the scale of interruption across a region that sits at the center of the global copper economy. The shaking was felt from Arica and Parinacota in the far north down into Atacama, with reported intensity spanning places such as Cuya, Arica, Codpa, Iquique, Antofagasta, Mejillones, San Pedro de Atacama, Chañarol, Diego de Almagro, El Salvador, Copiapo, Caldera, and Tierra Amarilla. On screen, this is where the map should widen. Not one city, but an entire corridor of desert settlements, coastal ports, industrial zones, and mining communities reacting at once. Emergency agencies moved quickly to confirm there was no tsunami threat, but on the ground, the disruption was real. Power failures darkened neighborhoods. Municipal teams were forced into rapid inspection mode. Mining companies activated emergency protocols and paused operations to inspect facilities. Codelco halted some activities because of reduced visibility in pits and electricity interruptions in specific zones. while other major operators reported no significant structural disruption. That contrast is the story. A quake strong enough to rattle the strategic heart of Chile's economy, but contained enough that the worst-case scenario did not arrive. And for several tense hours, nobody could be completely sure it wouldn't. If you want more real disaster breakdowns told in this style, consider subscribing. Then came the second layer of tension: aftershocks. The Chilean seismological authorities reported multiple follow-up quakes after the main shock, with at least 7 recorded in the area and the strongest reaching magnitude 4.3. That matters because aftershocks change the psychology of a disaster. The first quake forces people out of buildings. The next ones keep them from going back in. Inspectors cannot move quickly, utility crews have to work under uncertainty. Families already dealing with blackouts now have to decide whether the worst is over or whether another jolt is coming. By that stage, officials in the education sector confirmed classes would be suspended the following day in Calama, so school facilities could be checked for safety. The immediate danger had passed. The instability had not. The science behind this event helps explain why it felt so large, yet produced comparatively limited destruction. Chile sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where the Nazca Plate is being forced beneath the South American Plate. This collision generates constant seismic activity. In this case, the quake was deep, more than 100 kilometers down, which usually means the energy spreads over a broader area, but loses some of the violent surface-breaking force that makes shallow earthquakes especially deadly. That is one reason the shaking was reported across such a wide swath of northern Chile. It also explains why Chile's Hydrographic and Oceanographic Service ruled out a tsunami threat so quickly. This was not the kind of offshore seafloor displacement that pushes walls of water toward the coast. The quake was dangerous, but dangerous in a very specific way. The full scale becomes clearer when you stop thinking in terms of epicenter alone. This earthquake was perceived between the regions of Arica and Parinacota and Atacama, reaching communities scattered across one of the driest and most economically strategic landscapes on Earth. It shook coastal cities, inland desert towns, tourism centers, and the mining belt that feeds a substantial share of Chile's copper output. The USGS community intensity mapping and subsequent aftershock tracking showed a broad footprint, reinforcing what residents already knew from experience. A deep northern Chile quake can reach far beyond the point on the map where it begins. That is what made this event so compelling from a documentary perspective. It was not a narrow local emergency. It was a regional stress test felt across infrastructure, industry, and daily life all at once. By the end of the first response phase, Chilean authorities had confirmed what could have been much worse. No fatalities, no reports of serious injuries, and no major collapse of critical infrastructure. But minimal damage did not mean no damage. Tens of thousands still lost power. Public health centers worked under limitations. School inspections forced a day of suspended classes. Mining sites had to stop, assess, and cautiously resume. And residents across the north were told to remain alert as aftershocks continued. In Chile, earthquakes are part of national memory, but that does not make them ordinary. What this event revealed was not only the force of the quake itself, but the strength and the limits of the systems built to absorb it. In a region where the Earth is always under pressure, survival often depends on what keeps functioning in the minutes after the shaking starts. This time, enough of it did.